So this evening we'll be continuing with our study in the book of Ecclesiastes. If you're just now joining us, we're to chapter 4 of 12 chapters. So I won't spend too much time boring the people that have already been watching with lengthy recaps, but since Ecclesiastes is really kind of an argumentative essay towards Solomon finding out what the meaning of life is, we have to recap somewhat. So each chapter will build on each other and build to the conclusion that's going to occur finally in chapter 12, and actually the last verses of chapter 12. So if we remember back to chapter 1, it was the introduction, and Solomon opens up the book of Ecclesiastes, with this phrase, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And what is the meaning of this life? What is the meaning of all this labor that man is doing under the sun? So he opens up with that, catchy phrase there, and he introduces his subject. And like we said in chapter 1, God is a God that likes those that will seek after him and will read and study his word, and he invites us to seek after him. So that was chapter 1. In chapter 2, Solomon starts to talk about pleasure and his pursuit of pleasure. This was something that he was able to pursue to the nth degree, being a king and very wealthy. So he talks about pleasure, and it did bring him some joy to have friends and to have nice things and to build pools of water and forests and all these things. But in the end, it really didn't bring him any lasting joy or peace. It didn't bring any meaning to his life. So he said that too was just vanity. And then in chapter 3, Solomon stops looking at himself for just a while, and he starts expanding out, and he looks at who God is. And that's what we talked about last time. And as we talked about, the Byrds in the, I think, 1960s had that song, Turn, 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 that was the beginning of Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Well, that is an explanation of the balance of God, who God is. And in essence, he is balanced. Nothing happens out of season. Nothing happens out of turn with God. He is always in season, and everything is done according to his way and to his timing. So Solomon sees that that's who God is in chapter 3, and he starts to look at what man is and who man is. And he looks at two institutions, if you remember. He looks at the civil institutions of the courts. Of course, at the time, I know they were a part of the temple and the religious life as well. But he looks at the courts, and he looks at the temple as that second institution. I think of them as the bookends of society. They encompass all of society, and these are two institutions that should be held in high regard. But does he find the balance? Does he find godliness in these places where he should find godliness? And no, he does not. They're run by men, and he says, iniquity and wickedness in these places. Here were places that were supposed to be of justice, and they were supposed to be of right worship towards God, and he found iniquity, and he found injustice in those places, wickedness in those places. So Solomon here in chapter 4, he's going to begin building on chapter 3. In chapter 3, people may have looked back at that and they said, well, Solomon, you only really looked at two places in society. And both of those places are controlled by the wealthy and the, religious. What about the other 99% of us that aren't a part of temple life or a judge or part of this civil institution, the court system? What about us? We're not like those people. Humanity really isn't like that, Solomon. Or maybe they thought otherwise. Maybe they thought that, as I hear some people think that, well, Solomon, it can't be that bad. I'm in the middle class or I'm poor. And you know what? It would be much better. It would be much easier to be rich. I hear people all the time at work, and, I have to admit, in my earlier years before I was saved, I would get pulled into, the lottery pool at work. We're going to make all this money. All you got to do, put a couple bucks in, and wouldn't it be nice to be rich? And you would start to think about and fantasize about all the things you could do with millions. And even at one time, I think it was up to $1 billion in the lottery. If I won that, if I had that all to myself, what I could do with that money, it would be so easy. My life would be so secure. So that's the perception that some have, and perhaps some that are in those wealthier classes. They may be thinking, hey, if I was in the lower class, if I was poor, it would probably be easier. My life would be simpler. I wouldn't have to worry about paying the bills and paying my employees and whether or not my business is going to make it or not. Maybe I'd be able to have vacations. Maybe I'd be able to have more friends. It would be a simpler life. So Solomon here in chapter 4, he's going to start to look at society. And he really does this by giving us 3 vignettes here, 3 little pictures of society, showing us what is truly done under the sun. And as you can imagine, he's going to find out that in this world, in all classes, there really is oppression and loneliness. So first is the poor man, and we're going to see him talked about in the first 3 verses. Then we've got, secondly, the middle class, the working man in verses 7 through 12. And then thirdly, we're going to talk about the wealthy or the kingly class in verses 13 through 16. So if you would, just please open your Bibles or scroll to it on your phone, as I know most of you will probably do. And let's read Ecclesiastes chapter 4. And we'll start off with at least the first 3 verses. I'll probably go a little bit further than that, maybe even to the end of the chapter. I don't know. Let's see where we want to stop. So it says, "So I returned." So Solomon's going back to what he had visited before. "So I returned, and I considered all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of such as were oppressed, and they had no comforter. And on the side of their oppressors there was power, but they had no comforter. Wherefore I praise the dead which are already dead more than the living which are yet alive." So Solomon here says that the dead were actually better off than these poor people. And then he goes even further in verse 3. He says, "Yea, better is he than both they which hath not yet been, who hath not seen the evil work that is done under the sun." Reminds me of the book of Job. Job wished at one point in time that, not that he was dead, but that he had not even ever been born. And here Solomon, he kind of is coming to a similar conclusion here. He says, the poor are so oppressed that it would almost be better that they had not been born, because there's no one to bring comfort to them. So let's look at this briefly here. So the poor man, there were biblical expectations for the poor in Israel. And I think it's interesting, oftentimes when we study the Bible, and it's always right to go ahead in the Bible. It's always right. It's always okay to go into the New Testament and tie these Old Testament texts to things that we know and we love and enjoy today through the New Testament and this dispensation. But I always think it's interesting to go back in the Bible to what Solomon would have already known, what had already been revealed in his day and in his time. So, I can't even go very far because Isaiah and Jeremiah and the prophets, they haven't come into being yet. So this is before them. But even back in the book of Deuteronomy, there were expectations for how the poor were to be treated. So let's see if what Solomon observed, if it lives up to the standard that God had already set. And in Deuteronomy, the 15th chapter, 11th verse, you don't have to necessarily go there, but it says, "You shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy and to the poor in your land." So God set the expectation that the poor were not to be oppressed, but they were to be taken care of. So, yet we see here, as Solomon sees, that these poor, they're heavily oppressed. They're pressed in from every direction. And to add to their misery in the sin of this nation, because they're not doing what God told them to do, there was none to stand and defend them. That's what other versions say. Here in the King James English, it says none to comfort them. But it says there's none to stand and defend them. So it didn't matter whether it was their own poor comrades or whether it was some wealthy benefactor, no one would stand up and speak for these people. They were total outcasts in their society. And in fact, by the time Jesus comes onto the scene, we know that the Jewish religion held that if you were poor, you must have sinned against God. And that was the mindset of these people. Yet God said that there will always be poor in your land and you're to take care of them. So when I hear of their plight, the plight of these poor here, my mind always goes back to other things that I've read. And I recall my wife and we read a biography on William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army. And, he really was called by God to work with the poor. And I think of, when he put into practice what God said all the way back here in Deuteronomy, just the wonderful things that came out of that. And he was kind of a funny man. He said that really the ministry that God had given him was soup, soap, and salvation. And he provided those things to the poor, and he saw them saved by the thousands. And that's what happens when somebody does what God says, and they speak up for the poor, and they see their plight, and they don't oppress them, they help them, and they point them to Christ. But I digress a little bit here. So there's people's expectations of the poor. Like I said earlier, there's some that may think, well, they live a simple and a carefree style of life. They can probably go out to the park every day, and I have seen people on YouTube that live kind of a nomadic lifestyle, so they can go hiking and stuff and post that on YouTube. And some people live that way, but by and large, it's a lifestyle that does not deliver on what people's expectations of it is. It's not simple. It's not easy. So the reality is that the poor here, they are oppressed to the point where they despair and where they believe that it would be better, that they didn't even exist. They, in the end, are alone and in need of a friend. So what about these middle-class workers? What about them? Let's read a little bit further here. And it says here in verse 4, we're going to pick it up. It says, "Again, I considered all travail and every right work, for this a man is envied of his neighbor. This is also vanity and vexation of spirit." So here you have a man that is working, that is earning his wages, But he says it's still vanity and vexation in spirit. He says, then a fool foldeth his hands together and eateth his own flesh. Better is a handful with quietness than both the hands full with travail and vexation of spirit. Now, as I was studying that, there's two ways you could take that. You could say either this fool, or in some versions it just says a lazy person, could be using this proverb here in verse 6 as an excuse to be lazy. I'd rather just not have to deal with the problems of life. I'd rather just be poor, or have others support me or help me or whatever. So that's why I'm going to be lazy. Or it could be a proverb of Solomon here for the virtues of work. Hey, it's better to do enough work to keep you busy, to keep you fed, than to have all this travail and this hard work and great vexation of your spirit trying to get something that you don't necessarily need. We're pretty good about that here in the United States. There's a lot of things we could probably live without, and that we're learning that we can live without. But whether you want to take that either way, that verse 6 is in there, and it could be, like I said, just the fool or the lazy person talking there. So he says, and he goes on here, so he saw that people are working, but some tend towards the lazy side. Then he says, then I returned again and saw vanity under the sun. And this time he says, there is one alone. He sees a different worker here, and there is not a second. So this man, it says he doesn't have neither a child nor a brother, and yet there's no end of all his labor. Neither is his eye satisfied with riches. Neither saith he, for whom do I labor, and bereave my soul of good? This is also vanity, yea, it is a sore travail. So there you have the middle class man, the working man. There was expectations, again, given in the Bible for the working man and the working class. In Leviticus 19, it says if you were a worker and you hired other people, you were expected to be fair and to treat your workers fairly and to pay them on time. You were not allowed to withhold their pay. And in Leviticus 25, there's rules on buying and selling of property. And again, it says in, I believe it's, I didn't write the reference down, but it says, but the middle class, the property owning class, they were told, and if thou sell aught unto thy neighbor, or buyest aught of thy neighbor's hand, ye shall not oppress one another. Be fair. So these middle class people, they were to be fair. They weren't to be selfish and stingy. They weren't to, try to one up each other. They were just supposed to live and glorify God for what he had given them. But what does Solomon find? He finds that while this should have been an equitable lifestyle that was conducive to polite society and to the rearing of children, instead it turned out to either go maybe into the direction of laziness or greed or envy. They were all intertwined here that eventually led to these people to, in a way, self-isolate, whether it be because they didn't want to do the work or because they were envious of what others had, or others were envious of them, or they were just selfish. And so there's people that have this expectation of the middle class life, that it's going to be meaningful, it's going to be family friendly and family centered. However, the reality here was that it often led to the individual either isolating themselves to pursue a lifestyle of laziness or to become a workaholic. And in the end, just like the poor man, the middle class man may become isolated and in need of a friend. Now, what about the wealthy person? So I'm going to skip down here to verse, let's start with verse 13. So 13 really gives us this little vignette of the wealthy person. It says, "Better is a poor and wise child than an old and foolish king, who will no more be admonished. For out of prison he cometh to reign, whereas also he that is born in his kingdom becometh poor." And I always like to think about, when I'm reading these verses, think about other stories. What does this remind you of? A person that came out of prison and cometh to reign. I'll give you a second. Think. Maybe Joseph, right? He was a man that was imprisoned in Egypt and became second only to Pharaoh. And, I think that Solomon is even, going back thinking about him as well, just how it's written here. But that's my opinion and the opinion of some of the commentators. And then verse 15, we'll pick it up, says, "I considered all the living which walk under the sun with the second child that shall stand upon his stead. There is no end of all the people, even of all that have been before them. They also that come after shall not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and vexation of spirit." Here's where I think the King James English gets a little bit confusing. If you read this in the English Standard Version or the New International Version or one of the more modern translations, you'll find that essentially what Solomon is talking about is a king that is very popular. His people enjoy his reign. But as time goes along, a second generation rises up, and they don't necessarily like this king as much as the older generation did. They want a change. Boy, haven't we heard that? Change, change, change. Every time an election comes up, we want a change. They don't even know what change they want. They just don't want that king. And that's what Solomon's pointing out here. He's talking about a second, that second child. So it's the child of the king. They're looking for someone new to replace them. These people they're very fickle. They're always looking for change. And he talks about 3 generations even in these few verses here, and all of them want to change. So even though, somebody has this high kingly position, there's always that danger of traitors and things like that arising and the overthrow of the king. And, we saw that with King Saul. While King Saul was still on the throne, people were praising David. We saw that with King David. While David was on the throne, people wanted his son Absalom. We even get a feeling that while Solomon was on the throne, because as soon as he died, the people come to Rehoboam and they ask Rehoboam, Solomon's son, "Hey, will you ease up on all of the taxes and the hard work and labor that we're doing? Will you ease up on us?" So they were even looking for a change during Solomon's time, and maybe Solomon's even alluding to that in these few verses. So what about the wealthy here? So, in particular, we're talking about the kingly. Remember in chapter 3, he talked about kind of the courts and the temple life, but now we're kind of talking about the wealthy, the noble class, the king. They have it all, right? They have it easy, right? But Solomon here, he says, that's not the case. And again, there were biblical expectations on that king that were given back in Deuteronomy, the 17th chapter, verses 14 through 20. I'm not going to read it, but essentially, God said that the king would be chosen by him, and the king would rule over the people and have authority over the people. This king was going to have to be a member of the nation of Israel, was not allowed to be a foreigner. They were not allowed to acquire or amass horses and wives and silver and gold in excess. I mean, wow, what king on this earth have you ever seen that has not done those things? So it doesn't sound too much like an earthly king, does it? This king was to never return the people back to Egypt. And one of the interesting things was that they had to actually have a copy of the law of Moses in their possession, and they were to study it daily. Wouldn't this world be a different place if each one of our legislators and those in power had to have a copy of the Word of God and read and study it daily and live by it? No, I don't know that they would do any better than what the kings of Israel did, because many of them, I would say, did not follow through on that. And again, in 1 Samuel, the 8th chapter, Samuel warns the people that this king will have authority over them, that they will not always like what he does, that he will take their sons and daughters and put them to use in his service, that he's going to tax them, that he's going to lead them into wars that they may not necessarily want to go into. He will have authority over them. Yet the people still wanted a king, and they got the king. But this position, though, it should have been a highly honored position. It should have been the perception that the people had that this was a secure position. And even today, well, if I win the lottery, I'll be secure. I'll have all this money. I'll be in this position like a king. And that's what these people had. But come to find out that through the fickleness of the people that supported the king and always demanded change, they were always looking for the king's successor, just like Saul and David and Solomon. This king and these people, they ended up, in the end, being left alone and needing a friend. So here's the theme of this chapter, is that all humanity across the board is mean, selfish, and fickle. And you say, Brother Troy, that's really not a nice thing to say about us. But isn't it true? I've always told my kids, and maybe I've said it before, I can't remember. I'll repeat it again because I think it's worth repeating. But the Bible, to me, in my reading of it, is given for three main purposes. The first being to show who God is. He's creator, he's holy, he's perfect, he's pure. The second is to show who man is without God. He's all the opposite. He's impure, he's not holy, he's unjust, he's sinful. Every chance he has, he will work against the work of God. He has a bent against God. But then the third thing is how an unholy and sinful man can come into relationship with a holy and a pure and a just God. And his justice our sin had to be paid for to bring us together. We had to be justified in the eyes of a just God, and that could only come through his Son, Jesus Christ. And I think we often forget that we are being confronted in the Bible with who we are as human beings. There's verses in there that I think a lot of people skip over that they don't think too much about, but, when you read about it and you think about it, it deals a blow to the human heart, at least to my heart. And one of them we talked about last time was that an unjust balance is an abomination to God. That same abomination that that word that's used to describe adultery and so many other bad things in the Bible that, maybe we wouldn't think about even committing. But here he's saying an unjust balance is an abomination. Being unfair is an abomination. And I was thinking, I could probably think back 2 or 3 times this week that maybe I was unfair or unjust. And, we have to, when we open up this book, we have to be confronted by it on a daily basis. We have to be confronted by it. And we have to be reminded of our need of Jesus Christ every day. That's important to us. So here we are. We are confronted with the reality that man and people in general are mean, selfish, and fickle. This leads the poor to despair. It leads the working man to selfishness. And it leads the wealthy to stubborn conceit. Solomon said there a minute ago that, the king that is unwilling to be admonished, to accept sound counsel, that king is not worth as much as a youth that will listen, that will work and do the things that God requires of him, that will work with his fellow man. So all of this leads man to loneliness and in need of a friend that will stick closer than a brother. So, I was thinking, Solomon in the prior chapter, he saw that man was so out of touch with who God was that there had to be a judgment coming. And I almost wonder now if Solomon isn't considering the need for a friend in that coming judgment. But we have an answer here. Solomon gives us a little bit of an answer in verses 9 through 12, and let's read that real quick here. He says, 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him that is alone when he falleth, for he that hath not another to help him up. Again, if 2 lie together, then they have heat. But how can one be warm alone? And if one prevail against him, 2 shall withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. So we see here that, I think these verses, they point to friendship. It's important to have friendship. Many of the commentators, they discussed, the warmth that's talked about here, 2 lying together. They'll have enough warmth to get through a cold night. And really in the Christian sense, that we are to exhort each other to good works and to love one another and to love other people. And a lot of times that happens better when we are together. That's why Paul, told us not to forsake the gathering of ourselves together. We're supposed to be together as Christians, to love one another and to exhort each other to good works. So more warmth will be displayed in this world when we first display it in the church and together. But secondly, I think also this can even speak of the institutions that God has set forth, such as marriage and the family. There's many times when someone may fall and need help back up, and that's a lot easier in the context of a family. Whether it be a husband or a wife or a child, we can see many examples of a child that's going down a wrong path, and it makes a difference if there's a mother or a father or even a grandmother or grandfather that will go get that child and, talk some sense into them. And maybe it doesn't happen right away, but eventually that young man or that young woman often will come back to their senses. And we see the other way. If there's nobody when that person falls, when that person goes astray, what can happen in those situations. So I think that these verses, they pertain to friendship, to marriage and the family. But by the wording of Solomon here in verse 12, I think he's thinking of something a little bit higher than even that, because he talks about two in all these verses, but then he gets to the end and he says a threefold cord is not easily broken. Why all of a sudden a threefold cord? Why not a twofold cord? Well, certainly the Bible reminds us that where two or three are gathered together, God will be in the midst of them. And I think that Solomon is speaking of the relationship that we have with God. And that we are in need of a friend, and it doesn't matter what walk of life you are on. It doesn't matter how much money you have in the bank account, that it's real easy. And at one point in time, you will find yourself probably lonely in this world and in need of a friend. I got to thinking about that cord. And, if you've ever seen a rope or a wire rope like they use on cranes and stuff like that, it's twisted together. It's not just a couple strands hanging there next to each other, but it's twisted together so you can't hardly tell one strand from the next. You can't follow it around and know which one is which. And I tell you, it just blew my mind the other night thinking that that's how our relationship with Jesus Christ should look as well. When people look at us, they shouldn't say, well, that part's Troy, and that part's like Christ, and there's another part that's like Troy, that's very, worldly, and there's a part that looks like Christ. You shouldn't be able to tell the difference. Jesus Christ should be intertwined into our life. He should be wrapped up in all of our life, a part of all of our life, until all somebody sees is that one strong cord. That just, like I said, that just kind of blew my mind the other night thinking about that. So as I conclude tonight, I ask, is that true of your life tonight? Certainly we are all in need of a friend. And like Solomon said, this judgment, it's coming upon this wicked world. God is a God of balance and a God of justice and a God of righteousness. And he is coming to set things straight. These poor and these oppressed will not remain poor and oppressed forever. These that are committing wickedness in high places will not continue to commit wickedness forever. And those that are alone and lonely, they will not be lonely forever. So where is your life in Jesus Christ tonight? Let him be a part, or let yourself be a part of that threefold cord. Let your life be intertwined with his. Let him make of you what he would like to.